How to debunk just about anything. 1. Before commencing to debunk, prepare your equipment. Equipment needed: 1 armchair. 2. Put on the right face. Cultivate a condescending air that suggests that your personal opinions are backed by the full faith and credit of God. Employ vague, subjective, dismissive terms such as ridiculous, or trivial, or anecdotal in a manner that suggests they have the full force of scientific authority. 3. Portray science not as an open-ended process of discovery, but as a holy war against unruly hordes of quackery-worshipping infidels. Since in war the ends justify the means, you may fudge, stretch, or violate the scientific method, or even omit it entirely, in the name of defending the scientific method. 4. Keep your arguments as abstract and theoretical as possible. This will send the message that accepted theory overrides any actual evidence that might challenge it, and that therefore no such evidence is worth examining. 5. Reinforce the popular misconception that certain subjects are inherently unscientific. In other words, deliberately confuse the process of science with the content of science. Someone may, of course, object that, since science is a universal approach to truth-seeking, it must be neutral to subject matter. Hence, only the investigative process can be scientifically responsible or irresponsible, meaning the skeptic is at fault. If that happens, dismiss such objections using a method employed successfully by generations of politicians. Simply reassure everyone that there is no contradiction here, and we all laugh out loud. The term pseudo-skeptic has found use in those fields where opposition from those within the scientific mainstream or from scientific skeptics is strong. In 1994, Susan Blackmore, a parapsychologist who was a pseudo-skeptic and eventually became a CSICOP fellow, in 1991, described what she termed the worst kind of pseudo-skepticism. There are some members of the skeptics groups who clearly believe they know the right answer prior to inquiry. They appear not to be interested in weighing alternatives, investigating strange claims, or trying out psychic experiences or altered states for themselves, heaven forbid, but only in promoting their own particular belief structure and cohesion. I have to say it, most of these people are men. Indeed, I have not met a single woman of this type. Ironically, she is one herself. We laugh out loud. That telling description by Susan Blackmore of the pseudo-skeptic's passive-aggressive non-participation is illustrated right here. Numerous pseudo-skeptics watching these videos are so disabled they cannot cut two coat hangers, bend them letter L-shaped, and search for another coat hanger, even though it is attested to and verified by Arthur C. Clarke and James Randi in a 1980 video, and a Utah professor, demonstrating virtually anyone, every novice, can do dowsing. With their perpetual avoidance of the situation content, the evidence, by arguing off the point, by always falsely disputing the scientific method, we can only conclude the pseudo-skeptic is really only a learning disabled antagonist personality, merely posing as a superior scientific mind. It often surprises pseudo-skeptics that their regimented lockstep behavior is so predictable. They subscribe to James Randi and don't seem to realize they are joining a very large, disaffected group that is well studied and expertly documented. At the superb website, debunking-skeptics.com, there is a Nobel Prize winner on the board. Skeptics would do well to go there and browse. They could learn something about themselves, of some use. Now it's said there, above, skeptics' behavior is lockstep regimented, making them, oh, so predictable. We must ask the question, why? And how did they all get that way? So similar. The answer might come from an unlikely source, suggested by none other than parapsychologist Rupert Sheldrake, who confesses to being an atheist skeptic himself, and explains why he was a skeptic, and then being impressed, but just too busy elsewhere, when shown genuine evidence of telepathy. Excerpt follows from Sheldrake's latest YouTube lecture. The key word to bear in mind is Pavlov, as in animal conditioning. Sheldrake had it done to him. Yes, it works on humans, also. Like you, maybe.
The theme of telepathy is particularly appropriate because the Perrott Warwick Fund was set up in memory of Frederick Myers, a Fellow of Trinity College, and one of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research in 1882. And it was Myers who coined the word telepathy He was a Greek scholar. And of course, telepathy means tele, as in distant, as in television, telephone, and feeling, as in empathy, sympathy. So telepathy literally means distant feeling. In the early days of the Society for Psychical Research, one of the big issues was the survival of bodily death. And that was one of the topics Myers himself was very interested in. I think partly because telepathy was associated with this quest for evidence for survival, the focus was on telepathy in human beings. Now this made it more controversial than it needed been, because the people who opposed telepathy were people who saw themselves as heirs of Enlightenment rationalism, who saw an opposition between what they thought of as the advance of science and reason, as opposed to religion and superstition, which they thought were holding humanity back. Telepathy got classified as superstition because so many people believe in it. This meant that telepathy has always been controversial, and it's always been something that people who believe in a kind of materialist worldview feel that they need to oppose. Now, I'm going to talk this evening about the evolution of telepathy. My point is that it's not actually a supernormal or supernatural, but that it's, or paranormal, it's natural, normal, and a part of animal nature. It occurs in many different species of animals, and human telepathy is simply one aspect of a much more widespread phenomenon. I might say just one or two words about why I got interested in this subject. I was educated in a normal scientific way at school and at Cambridge, and I absorbed the standard scientific mindset, which involved, at least when I was being educated, atheism, materialism, and total skepticism to all psychic phenomena. This was just part of the standard issue mindset that people of my generation grew up with, and still many young scientists today follow that same way of thinking. So I thought telepathy was absolute rubbish, that it couldn't possibly happen because the mind's nothing but the activity of the brain, it's all inside the head. And so telepathy must be rubbish, therefore all evidence for it must either be fraudulent or flawed. And there are many people who still think that today, of course. But what stopped me thinking like that was an experience in Cambridge in the biochemistry department. One time in the tea room, someone brought up the topic of telepathy, and along with several other research students, I said, oh, it's absolute rubbish, and said all the standard skeptical things. But sitting nearby was one of the older members of the department, Sir Rudolph Peters, previously professor of biochemistry at Oxford, who in his retirement was working in our lab here in Cambridge. And Sir Rudolph said to me, have you ever looked at the evidence for it? And I said, no, I don't need to. He said, well, I have, and he said, I think there might be something in it. And he then told me about an investigation he'd done. A friend of his called E.G. Recordon was an ophthalmologist in Cambridge. He was treating a boy who was severely disabled, who was almost blind and who was mentally retarded. And when he was doing standard eye tests, he was astonished that this boy could actually read all the letters on the eye charts, and he knew he couldn't possibly read them, and at first he thought it was lucky guesswork. Then he thought maybe it was happening through the mother, and he asked the mother to leave the room, and the boy couldn't do it. He told Sir Rudolph Peters, and they set up some simple tests with the boy and the mother separated by a screen, and they showed her letters and numbers, and the boy immediately said what they were. They then set up an experiment over the telephone with the boy at home in Cambridge and the mother in Babraham in a laboratory 6 miles away. They showed the mother cards, a random number of sequence of letters and numbers, which were pre-randomized. She looked at them, and the boy would then say what she was looking at. With the letters, he should have been right one time in 26, on average 3.8%. He was actually right 38% of the time in more than 100 trials. These were massively significant results. And Sir Rudolph Peters was convinced that something was really going on. the only possible clues could have been by subtle sound clues. They had magicians listen to the tape to see if there was any fraud. I listened to them myself. And Peter's convinced me that this research showed something was really going on. He was an honest man. He was totally had no axe to grind. And I was very impressed by the fact that here was a piece of research that showed something was really happening. When I discussed it with my colleagues, they reacted exactly as I'd reacted myself, saying, oh, it must be flawed. They weren't interested in looking at the evidence. And I realized this is a diagnostic feature of skepticism about psychic phenomena, an unwillingness to look at the evidence because of a firm belief it must be untrue. Well, I didn't drop everything and start working on telepathy because I was working on other things.
So I'm now going to open the floor for questions. Yes, gentlemen.
Thank you. Yes, I wonder, in your talk you talked about people who didn't want to look at the evidence, but have you had experiences of people who started off skeptical, but then were willing to look at the evidence, and then changed their mind in conversation with you, or what's been your experience?
Well, there are certainly. The point is, it depends what kind of skeptic. There's the kind of conventional skeptic, like I was myself, people who just mouth these skeptical opinions and believe them because it's part of their scientific conditioning. There are other people who feel very, very strongly about it and belong to skeptical organizations. There are quite a lot of sort of self-appointed vigilante groups, like the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal in America. And the skeptic magazines in America have about 100,000 subscribers. The total number of active researchers in parapsychology in America is about 10. So you can see they're enormously outnumbered by these highly motivated skeptics. They're usually militant atheists, and they feel that their whole worldview would be threatened by the existence of psychic phenomena. Now, most people who are not part of those organizations, I think most people in the world of science don't have those extreme views and are indeed open to evidence. I've often given talks in scientific institutions and university departments, and I find that the majority of people are actually open to it, largely because they've experienced it themselves. A lot of scientists have dogs waiting for them at the door when they get home from the lab, and many have had the experience with telephone calls. So for people like that, the evidence is of interest, and I think they're the majority. So it's only the extreme skeptics who I think will never change their minds. I think most scientists are trained in a skeptical attitude. It's part of science. I mean, I have it myself. All peer review process involves skepticism in every branch of science. It's only this dogmatic form of skepticism that's evidence-free that's a big problem. But people who believe that are often very vociferous.
But you've had experiences then with people, say, who don't have pets. They don't have any personal connection, but just looking at the evidence. They started off skeptical, but the evidence itself was enough to change their mind?
Well, I don't know how many people have fit into that category. Probably not very many. And when it comes to an issue like this, most people's opinions are based largely on their own experience or the experience of people they know. If they think these phenomena are real, it's largely on the basis of personal experience. The evidence then helps to give them permission, as it were, to take their experience seriously. Because normally they don't feel they have that permission. I gave a talk in a Department of Animal Behavior, not 1,000 miles from here, there were 6 key members of staff at the talk, and afterwards, in the tea break, all 6 came up and said, you know, I'm really interested in these things. I think they really happened. I think this evidence is very persuasive, but I can't discuss it with my colleagues because they're all so straight. When all 6, including the professor, had said the same thing to me, I said, you know, why don't you guys come out? You'd have so much more fun. There's a very big difference between what people in the scientific world say in public and what they think in private. And the openness to the evidence is actually quite great, and I think a lot of scientists would be very pleased if these were permitted subjects of research within scientific institutions, as they are indeed in several British universities, and indeed right here in Trinity College, which is one of the Pt1 Fund here is one of the biggest funds for this research in Britain, if not in the world.